Merci, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you and to be with you today for this panel. And so I've just realized that since I'm speaking right after you, I'm speaking in French. So first, I will greet my guests before switching languages. We have here with us today Mr. Tidjane Thiam, who needs no introduction. We also have with us Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. They are, who needs no introduction either. They are two of the special envoys of the African Union, as well as another famous businessman from our continent, Tony Elumelu. This afternoon, or today rather, we will discuss Resilient Africa, and we have seen how resilient Africa has been since January when we were first affected by the pandemic. So I would like to ask a few questions of my guests in order to know how they live this experience in Africa, how they have perceived the response from Africa, and how these 3 months have affected them. And I will ask the first question to Dr. Ngozi Okonjo.
So I'm coming to you for the first question. We're talking about resilient Africa and how Africans are witnessing and living the COVID pandemic. Of course, we've seen data from the World Bank and the IMF that shows that growth is going to be severely compromised. The Economic Commission for Africa itself has done some analysis that shows that we will go from 3.2% growth to 1.8 in the best of cases, and maybe 0% growth. What do you think Africa is doing to be more resilient, and how do you see the crisis unfolding? I'll come back to you for what else the international community can do for this.
Well, thank you, Vera, for that. I must say that the narrative of the continent was, somewhat positive before the pandemic hit. If you recall, the IMF had projected a growth rate for 2020 for the continent of about 3.6%, compared to global growth of about 3.3%. So a relatively robust growth story or narrative. And then the pandemic hit. This pandemic has been a huge exogenous shock, a shock on both the supply and demand side that has resulted in the prices of our products that we export falling precipitously. At the same time, we've had difficulties with the prices of exports. We've had the prices of the products we import increase. Remittances have dried up on the continent, tourism, our currencies have depreciated, and there's been capital flight out of the continent. So all these things have happened with an event that has been external to us. And I think that the continent has really been acted, our leaders have acted responsibly and with a great sense of purpose and unity. And I think this has helped us to a tremendous extent, including also resilience that has come from the experiences we've had in the past with other infectious diseases like Ebola, where we've been able to develop systems for contact tracing and follow up with people. So that has been a hallmark. But coming back to the actions of our leaders, they've implemented lockdowns, which have been very difficult, social distancing. You know that 70% or more of our people work in the informal sector. So implementing a lockdown is courageous politically, means that people cannot go out and earn on a daily basis. In spite of all of this, our leaders have also implemented some economic measures. They've tried to do fiscal stimulus of about 0.8% of GDP. It's a fraction of what is being done in the rich countries, which is about 8 to 10%. They've suspended taxes and tariffs. The central banks have provided some liquidity to our businesses and SMEs. But this is not enough, given the extent of the shock we've suffered. Obviously, we need to go out to get more support in order for us to weather this shock. Let me finally say that on this segment, that the unity of purpose of the continent has been evident the African Union has come together, deciding to procure equipment together. They've appointed the 5 envoys to help look for external resources together. There's a great recognition that the only way we are going to fight this pandemic is through unity of purpose and unity of action. So this has been very pleasing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ngozi, for that very comprehensive answer, which shows, I think, how resilient and how responsive the African governments have been. Tidjane, I'm coming to you. We've seen, and I know President Ouattara is with us here today, in a country like Ivory Coast, something about $1.2 billion have been put to fight COVID. In Senegal, something in the same amounts. In Ghana, $700 million. A lot of our countries, heads of states, have released stimulus packages to support domestic business. But we know, as Ngozi said, that those stimulus packages will not be enough. Countries and leaders have shown resilience by deciding and allowing the private sector, and Tony is listening to this, not to pay taxes for 3 months. They have talked about standstills. When the ministers of finance met at the Economic Commission for Africa sometime at the end of March, they called for a global debt standstill for Africa. What is your sense of this? You have been a proponent and an advocate of this. Where are we with this conversation?
That's right, Vera. Good morning. I'd like to say hello to Ngozi and to Tony. Pleasure to be on this panel with them. And take 10 seconds to pay tribute to my friend Richard Atias. I've known Richard since '95, and an event like this is a realization of a vision he had for Africa. The fact that we can talk across continents with thousands of participants. So coming to your question, I think Ngozi did a very good job presenting the current challenge in Africa, drop in revenue. If you think about it in simple terms, the capital inflows have been going down. Tourism, export, remittances, commodity prices, plus the capital flight. And the capital outflows from Africa, which mainly concern with debt, have remained. So that has created a very high degree of pressure on the African economies. And we have a situation of quasi-negative net flows, as we say, where basically there is more capital coming out of Africa than coming into Africa, which is really an aberration. And that's really what drove the push for a debt standstill, to pass this very challenging situation and to make sure that what has started as a liquidity event doesn't become a solvency crisis. So the G20, as you know, Vera, and you were instrumental in that, has taken a number of steps to allow African countries to benefit from a standstill. But beyond that, we're also working as envoys and you and Ngozi to also deal with the issue of the commercial debt. Because as Africa made the progress that Ngozi described, actually a number of countries have become creditworthy and have rightly tapped the international capital markets. But confronted with a shock of this magnitude, there is a need to change the profile of that debt and improve its terms, probably with blended finance instruments, with a degree of concessionality and help from the international community. So we are working on this concept, and I'm quite optimistic that we'll get to something. But I just want to reiterate the extreme uncertainty we are facing. This crisis is only starting, and we have to make sure that we don't end up with a combination of the Spanish flu and the 1929-1930 depression, which would be an unprecedented event in world history. We're looking at drops in GDP. We're looking at increases in unemployment in developed economies, which will have a very severe impact on Africa. And we need to be proactive and anticipate and take measures to make sure that our populations who actually need investment in health, in education, in infrastructure, are very young and dynamic, can continue to see an improvement in their living conditions, which is what we have seen in the last 20 years in Africa, across Africa.
Thank you very much, Tidjane. I think you make a very important point here. Over the last 2 decades, let me say, Africa has really changed from a country where 75% of the countries on the continent were low-income countries to a continent today where over 75% of those countries are either beginning to become low middle income countries or middle income countries. A lot of those countries are now also accessing capital markets and would like to maintain their access to capital markets. So we hope that, I think as every country has reiterated, there are not going to be defaults on the continent, and we hope that we can continue to work with the private sector and our creditors to ensure that there is some resolution to our problem. I think when anybody who has visited Lagos knows about the Hilton Hotel in Lagos, the ECA just did some work that showed that one of the big sectors of the economies of Africa that are suffering from this crisis is the hospitality sector. Of course, with the tourism sector, which is particularly hitting women as well. Tony, you're not a woman, but you're going to talk about it. You have been a champion of youth employment and ensuring that women have access to business. But because of the tourism hit that is happening today on the continent, what do you see as a response that we can give to ensure that we can build back better, that we can come back? You are the demonstration of resilience in Nigeria. You've been able to provide energy, renewable energy on the continent. What is the private sector of the continent? As resilient as you are, what do you need to ensure that when we start to build back better, we can actually lift the youth with us and the women?
Vera, thanks so much. And let me say well done to my dear friend, Richard, for making this possible. He keeps trying to throw the light on Africa, because one of the things we need is we need the world to know what's happening on our continent. I'd like to start by saying, Vera, that it goes beyond hospitality sector. It goes beyond some of the issues that you've talked about. This pandemic is a very serious one. And indeed, I would say that without it, the African economic space was already in some form of dire straits. And I tell you from where I sit, my primary, one of the hats I wear is the hat of the group chairman for United Bank for Africa PLC that operates in 20 African countries and some other jurisdictions outside. Is that first, those who 10% or about less than 10% of our customers have over $1,000 balances in their accounts. And these 10% account for over 75% of our clientele, of our total deposit in all of these 20 countries that we're operating across Africa, with over 20 million customers. We're seeing significant and unacceptable unemployment rate in Africa. We have also seen endemic poverty. We talked today about some palliatives and some form of debt relief for Africa. But if we recall my big sister there, Ngozi, she was finance minister in Nigeria at this point, and she, President Obasanjo, they worked very hard for debt cancellation on Nigeria. Today, we're talking about debt relief, debt standstill for Africa. You know, for me, this is the kind of circularity that we should not allow to continue. So it goes beyond just one sector of the African economy. There's something that's not right. Disruption has come to stay. 2020 started with disruptions. And it just, in my viewpoint, it began. We will continue to have economic disruption, digital health, pandemic health disruption we'll have security disruption. And the point for every one of us is, how do we reset Africa so that when these disruptions come, because they will definitely come, we also have digital and technological disruptions. When they come, how are we able to withstand this? How do we ensure that we are not going to go again begging for debt relief for Africa? It's becoming, in my viewpoint, the circularity is becoming embarrassing to all of us. So we need to reset. We need to look at issues much more fundamental. We need to look at why are we where we are and what must we do to address this. So, and I must commend and congratulate my friend Tidjane and my big sister Ngozi for the great job they are doing as our envoys. In my viewpoint, as we engage with the rest of the world in providing relief, we'll call it, because it is relief, palliative. That is what it is, not a permanent solution to our issues. We need to look at it from a much more fundamental perspective. What must we do as a continent to ensure that when these disruptions come next, would be security disruption or technological digital disruption or economic disruption that will inevitably come, we are able to withstand this. I have often argued that we need a form of Marshall Plan. I came to the 1948 Marshall Plan that was put in place. We need to mobilize everyone so that Africa can come together. So that it's not just about the tourism sector, about one other sector. All of us can address this issue. Speaking specifically about the employment issue, I think if we look at the youth issue, if we have a Marshall Plan that mobilizes resources to address some critical sector like access to electricity, which is a major issue on the continent, then we'll begin the conversation. We'll begin to make sure that we don't go again begging for people to bail us out, because we must, as a continent, accept the fact that disruption has come to stay. If before maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and that won't happen. And so a solution to us should be much more than a sectoral, one sector approach. I think, do we have the resources and capability for this to happen? Yes. If you look at Ngozi, if you look at Tidjane, these are great Africans, and they can mobilize people, and both within and outside Africa, the private sector, the public sector. In my little world, as the founder of the Elumelu Foundation, we experimented something. We endowed $100 million to support young African entrepreneurs, young Africans who have economic ambitions. We believe that what we need is economic opportunity. And what we have done so far shows to us clearly that we can fix access to electricity on the continent, if we can ensure, like what Ngozi led for a long time when she was in Nigeria, for instance, stability of macroeconomic policy and environment. If we can prioritize the youth, to a large extent, we're able to fix some of these issues, because ultimately, unemployment level in Africa is unacceptable. Poverty level is totally endemic and cripple us. And these are things that predispose Africa to extremism. We must, and youth migration, we must fix them. To me, I see this pandemic as an opportunity to reset Africa. The easiest thing for us to do, the easiest escape for us is to just say, take more debts, give us a moratorium, or no interest repayment, and it keeps going on. And that circularity is an issue we must deal with. And to deal with it, we need to prioritize our young ones. We need to get our government to ensure stable macroeconomic policy. Some are doing very well in that area, but we need to bring everyone to the table. Let all of us see how we can deal with the issue of unemployment in a sustainable fashion. And to me, that is by empowering the small and medium-scale enterprises, the young Africans who have economic ambition, who are energetic, who work very hard, who want to succeed, and who have been succeeding from what we see.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you so much for that. I think that if I may be provocative, Africa has already launched its own plan. It's called the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. I think that if we are looking for a plan to reset and to recharge Africa, that is the plan. And as you said, you're in 21 countries on the continent. My sense is, can Africa use the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement? In the spirit of this conversation of resilient Africa, we have seen young scientists in Senegal doing test kits. We have seen people in South Africa doing ventilators, and across the continent, young women doing masks. So if ever there was a question about whether Africa was resilient, I think we have the answer. The question now is, what else do we need as enabling factors to make sure that we get there? You mentioned the capital markets and the issue of debt. Africa is going to need robust capital markets to continue growing. I don't know, I'm going to throw this question to you, Tidjane. You're coming from the world's apex of capital market development. No continent has developed without capital markets. What do you think we should do? People talk about local currency. A little bit of our debt problem is because we're borrowing in foreign currency. What can Africa do to indigenize its growth?
Yeah. No, thank you, Vera. And I'll try to not be too long, but I want to very, very violently agree with Tony. I think what he said is absolutely key. One word we don't say enough is entrepreneurs. I mean, you know, I've spent a lot of my career dealing with Asia, working with Asia for more than 20 years. The single unique characteristic is how many Tony Elomelus there are in Asia. If you look at the numbers, about 65% of the wealth created in Asia is created by first or second generation entrepreneurs. 65%. If you look at Europe, for instance, 65% of the wealth is owned by fifth or sixth generation people, i.e. it's the grandfather's grandfather who made them. And that dynamism that we've seen in Asia, particularly in China, is something that is at the heart of the wealth creation process. And a lot of what the countries need to do is to promote a class of entrepreneurs, because you can then drive forward the economy and generate the resources that would lead to employment. And we know what needs to be done, because it's been done in many places to get there. But that has to be an explicit objective of the policy. Now, as far as capital markets are concerned, the reality is we're going to need an external inflow of capital for a long time. We're going to need the government and the multilateral institutions to crowd in private capital because there is a huge need for investment. Tony mentioned energy, for instance, which is at the start of all development. I mean, if you take Côte d'Ivoire, we built independent, privately financed power plants back in the 90s, and that has played a big role in the current economic growth. So investment in infrastructure, investment in education, investment in health, all that has a relatively long paybacks, and we're going to need that infusion of capital. And I agree with Tony too. We must get out of this cycle of constant restructuring, even on a personal basis. If you lend money to a friend and every now and then he comes back and says, okay, why don't you forget about my debt? That's not going to work. Okay? So this pattern where we have to keep coming back, asking for reschedulings, relief, cancellations, has to be broken. And a big part of the answer is to really mobilize enough resources. And the African ministers have asked for $200 billion. If you look, just yesterday, Europe announced a $500 billion plan. We talk about $200 billion for a continent of 1.3 billion people. It's in the interest of the world economy to promote that growth in Africa and fund it, because the alternative scenario is unmanageable and will be a lose-lose for it.
Thank you so much. Ngozi, I'm coming to you. You have worked with the Nick Stern Commission on the Build Back Better Sustainable Development, looking into the future. And also, I have two questions for you. I've really been asked them quickly. The vaccines. How do we build back better? We know that Africa needs to diversify. What are the two messages that you have for Africa in the Build Back Better side? And I think a question that everybody is asking across the world, and you are now an envoy also to WHO, is Africa going to be first in line to get the vaccine as well?
Well, that's Vera, thank you. Those are a lot of questions to tackle, but I want to come back to the excellent points made by my brothers Tony and Tidjane, and build a little bit on that, on your Build Back Better question. The first thing I would like to say is that, as Tony mentioned, we can see this pandemic and this crisis as an opportunity for the continent. When we look at what has happened with some supply chains, for example, we saw that the whole world was scrambling with respect to getting all the test kits, the masks, the equipment needed, because most of the supply chains were outside of the continent. You mentioned the free trade agreement, continental free trade agreement. Well, we have to make this real. And this means we have to rely on ourselves and have a plan where we specialize our countries in manufacturing some of the things that we need so we can trade with other countries. Take pharmaceuticals, for instance. Your ECA has done work that shows that we import almost 94% of the pharmaceuticals we need on the continent. As we look at how we make opportunity out of this crisis, we should look at why don't we specialize in producing some of these pharmaceuticals. Some countries can take this up on the continent. Some are already doing it in Nigeria, South Africa. We're doing some of this. More of that could happen. Other areas where we could have a comparative advantage to produce good jobs for our young people. I totally agree that the focus should be on our young people, both producing good jobs in big enterprises, but also supporting them as entrepreneurs, particularly our women as well. As we build back better, we must also put women and youth at the center. We have to listen to what they have to say with respect to the future and involve them in the decision making. So I'd really like to stress that point. Jobs, jobs, jobs. What are we going to do to diversify our base on the continent so we can create the jobs we need? We are going to have the largest number of youth in the world by 2050. We have to think forward. Now, moving quickly to your question on vaccines. Well, you can see that there's a race on to be able to find the vaccines that would be a sustainable solution to the health crisis we're in. What has been very interesting in this crisis is the vulnerability of all systems all over the world. The rich countries that had strong health systems were overwhelmed, let alone ourselves. So looking to the future, sustainable solutions is what everybody's scrambling for. And we hope that those who are working on vaccines, that some of our African scientists can also be engaged. Our Africa CDC has done a wonderful job so far, even the CDCs in individual countries, and we hope to involve them in this work as we move forward. We are looking at these vaccines. There's a global effort underway with WHO at the center, Gavi, where I'm chair of the board, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. All are working with one purpose. When vaccines become available, they should be seen as a global public good, meaning that this should not be a question of profit for the companies that make it, but availability for everybody in the world at an affordable price. So that is the objective we have. In that circumstance, we are there to make sure that Africa will not be last in line, that all people, all our continent will be prioritized as well. This means we have to make large quantities and large volumes. And it is this very thing that Gavi, with the advanced market commitment, this is a financial instrument we have to assure we can manufacture enough volume for our continent. So don't worry, we will be prioritized.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think just in ending this conversation on resilient Africa, I'm sitting here in Ethiopia, in East Africa. We have had some of the largest growth rates, the largest GDP per capita increases, and the largest reductions in poverty on the continent. And I think that we want to continue to believe that we will do that and do that better. And there's no better example than Kenya and the work that they're doing on ICT to ensure that the youth have jobs. That shows us that Africa can be resilient, that the products that are coming out of Kenya in the ICT sector are being used in New York, in Asia. Tidjane, as you talk about it, the M-Pesa platform, can we digitize that? Can we move that to the capital markets? I think Africa has all the tools that it needs to become even more resilient and to ensure that we don't have this circularity that Tony talked about. So we hope that as we continue this debate, our leaders will tell us what they're doing and ensure that we can all build back better and be here again talking about how we came out of this crisis on our own. Thank you very much for this conversation, and everybody stay safe. And one last thank you to all our nurses who are on the front lines of this crisis to ensure that they are also safe. Thank you very much. And merci for the
Thank you once again, Richard, for this opportunity. I thank you and I give the floor back to you.
Merci, Vera. Merci à tous.
Merci, au revoir. Bye-bye. Bye.
Merci. Stay safe.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you very much. Merci, Tidjane. Thank you, Ngozi. Thank you, Tony. It was a very inspiring conversation. And at least I am taking one message. Let's try from this crisis to have more made in Africa ideas, made in Africa products, made in Africa everything. Now it's very clear that this call to action coming from key players and key actors from the private sector, from even economic experts. But now we would like also to hear from you once again, from you, the audience. So let's see our second polling questions. The second polling question is about the partnership. Which partnership Africa should continue to develop and to work with to recover? So you have several options. One option, of course, is the international multilateral institutions, UN, World Bank, IMF, the traditional partners. The second option could be the major trade partners, the countries working a lot with Africa, China, Turkey, of course, United States, the European Union, so far and so on. Africa regional institutions, African Development Bank, and the African Union, and of course the private sector. So let's vote and let's see who do you consider should be the key partners for Africa during this recovery. Quite interesting result, it's quite well balanced, and we see that international institutions as much as private sector, as much as African. So in fact, the answer and the message is very clear. Everyone has to work together. Everyone has to work together to be a true partner of Africa.